Okay, welcome back. So we had already discussed the first question of the First Continental Congress, which was how to justify their rights. So now we're looking at the second question, which was how to limit Parliament's power. And so there was kind of a middle course that they were writing between doing nothing to limit Parliament's power and then, the radicals like Samuel Adams, who wanted Parliament to have no power over the colonies. So they started looking to some different experiences they had with the Gaspee incident and what they felt was overreaching, as well as the coercive acts. And they ended up issuing the Declaration of Rights and Grievances, which asserted the right of the colonies to tax and legislate for themselves. This severely limited Parliament's power, so Parliament could still regulate trade, but again, they could not tax or legislate for the colonies. And they felt that this essentially was just a return to pre-1763 empire, so before the end of the 7 Years' War when England started implementing all those taxes. So they just wanted to go back to the way things were. And then we have the third question, which was how to resist these coercive acts, and then, if we include the Quebec Act, all five. And so they formed this Continental Association, and there was an agreement to cease all trade with Great Britain until the coercive acts were repealed. So, for example, everyone would stop drinking tea. Merchants would no longer import any British goods, so not just sending tea back, but sending everything back. And the produce exports, this was the one where they would hold off. So farmers had been kind of counting on, their tobacco and rice to be sold through British markets. And so in order to stop colonial farmers from taking a penalty, because they had already planted their crops, they gave it a year. So the following year is when they would stop colonial produce exports. And so with all these, agreements, they kind of expected a speedy repeal of those coercive acts, but they really didn't find one. So the repeal was not forthcoming, despite the punishments they felt were harsh enough to deserve one. So in Massachusetts, things are really heating up. Governor Gage of Massachusetts had dissolved the legislature there, but then it reformed as the Provincial Congress. So the legislature was banned, and these people illegally reformed their own Congress. And so the Provincial Congress assumed government, and they armed the militia. And in response, Governor Gage begged for more troops, telling the Crown, look, they're going against what we're saying. This is getting a bit out of hand. But his messages to England, some of them were sabotaged and destroyed, and then others, like any that actually reached where they were supposed to be going, were ignored, so they weren't really taken seriously. But really everywhere in Massachusetts was rebelling at this time. Farmers forced county courts closed. They established their own tribunals. Committees took over towns. They restricted trade. They started regulating everyday life, telling people not to act British. And they had spies out to go find English sympathizers. If people were found to be loyal to England instead of the colonies, they would be beaten up. They might be pelted with mud or dung, tar and feathering. And other colonies definitely started to follow in 1775. They started replacing royal authority at every level, so all those royal officials. And when other colonies started jumping in is when the king formally announced that the colonies were in open rebellion. So, we have this waiting game that kind of takes place. Governor Gage in Massachusetts is sort of waiting to be told, when am I supposed to strike? What's going on here? So he's waiting. Paul Revere and other express writers were kind of waiting for their signal to be told for them to react. So everyone was waiting for orders for Governor Gage. Eventually, Gage was given orders to seize the leaders of the Provincial Congress, kind of assuming that that would stop the rebellion if they could get those Congress members. And so when he received those orders, this was April 18th, 1775, the signal was kind of set. So this was a church signal, 2 lamps hung from the steeple, and that meant that British troops had marched out of Boston. And they were heading towards this cache of ammunition and arms that were stored in Concord, Massachusetts, that belonged to the Provincial Congress. And so this is kind of where you've heard of Paul Revere's famous raid. There were other writers as well. William Dawes. Sybil Ludington was a young 16-year-old woman who went out riding around telling people to get ready. And so they were getting all these Minutemen to go and get ready to fight. So we do have our first battle here. Sorry, it's a cough. First battle is at Lexington Green. And so this is directly on the road to Concord, which is where the British troops were headed to go seize that cache of ammunition and weapons. And 70 of the Minutemen, and Minutemen were these, like, provincial militia that were supposed to be ready in a minute's notice to go right out and fight. So 70 of these farmers, basically, waited at this green for the British troops to get there. And so 70 of these Minutemen versus the 700 troops that gathered at Lexington Green at 4 a.m. So quite outnumbered. Commander Pitcairn, who was the commander of the British troops, ordered the militia to disperse. And because they were so outnumbered, like ratio 1 to 10, they did start to disperse. They were like, yeah, okay, this isn't going to go well. As they were dispersing, somebody fired a shot. We're not quite sure who fired that shot, but in response to it, the British then started firing volleys. So they fired 2 volleys, and a volley is when everybody shoots at the same time. So when you see, like, in movies, they're like, ready, aim, fire, everyone shoots at the same time. So 2 rounds of that, and in those 2 volleys, 8 Americans died. And then British troops moved on to Concord. So that battle was done. As they're moving in, so this is 5 miles away, hundreds of Minutemen by this point are able to surge into Concord. So this is 7 a.m. when the British enter Concord, and they go, hang on, I need to advance this slide. They cross this bridge in the middle of town to get to their building, the building where those guns and ammunition are stored. And so they have 6 total companies, and 3 of them decide to wait on this bridge, to kind of stand guard, and the other 3 go to the building to go get the guns and ammunition. So the American Minutemen, who had surged into Concord at this point, fire at the half of the British troops that are on the bridge, and they really decimate a lot of them. They sort of made themselves an easy target there. So by noon, the British ended up retreating to Boston. So this one was a success for the Americans, especially because the whole way back to Boston, we have these British troops marching in formation, and they're very, orderly lines. The Americans are just picking them off the whole way, hiding behind fences, hiding in the forest, just shooting at these British troops. And so we do have a lot of casualties. So the British casualties end up being 273, and the Americans lose 95. And by the time everyone got back to Boston, the next evening, there were 20,000 New England militia marching on Boston, marching on the Redcoats, the British troops. And this is where we're going to leave this one. And next week we'll come back and talk about the Revolutionary War itself. So stay tuned. I'll see you next week.